morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Prabha. I started my career in Indian Express as a journalist, and in 1982, I joined the Indian Police Service. Today, I'll be talking about Pan-Islamic movements and the related funding and terrorist funding that goes along to sustain these movements. This is a very circular subject, and so I will have to keep referring to points back and forth. It's a little complicated, but I'll be giving you some written material along with this, and I hope there will be a lot of interaction about what I am speaking to you today. To start, I'd just like to start with the words of Thomas Friedman, who said, "All Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims." Needless to say, this caused a huge furore, with the Muslim community coming up in arms and saying that only 0.02% of the Muslim community was involved in terrorism. That is true. But I'd like to point out over here that this 0.02% has created a lot of disturbances in the world arena as of today. The 5 major Islamic terrorist groups, the 5 major terrorist groups are Islamist. I could name them and say ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram. Actually, the list is fairly endless. I could go on. Now, I'd also like to say that 95% of the conflicts in the world today are rooted in Islamic countries and have something to do with Islam. Now, at this point, I would like to add that all these terrorist groups use the Quran as legitimacy and validation for their actions. This is the point I'd like to discuss. Before going on to that, I'd like to say, while it is true that these terrorist groups are Islam-based, the fact also remains that many countries have used terrorism, have used Islam as foreign policy initiatives. This, in fact, has given a headwind and has given impetus to the terrorist movements. This is the aspect we'd also like to look at. Now, I'd like to talk about how, before getting on to the Quranic aspects which are being used by the terrorists, I'd like to talk about the usage that countries have made of Islam as their foreign policy initiatives to expand their own interests. The first thing is the Shia-Sunni divide. Now, it is, I think, not correct to talk about one old feud in the Middle East having an impact even today. No, it is a question of economics and the oil routes. What we can see is that there is an attempt to corner the oil movements and the oil fields of the sun. So we have seen that Iran has developed its own influence, raising up from Iran, Basra, through Iraq, up to Syria. This has caused a lot of problems traditionally with Saudi Arabia trying to curtail Iran's influence in the Middle East. Now we see that the Shia influence that Iran is trying to engender in these areas are based upon how they are going to increase their oil production. The same way, Turkey is trying to control its own interests by seeing that though it is not a major producer of oil, it is on the route of the oil trade, and it would like to remain pivotal in that position. Saudi Arabia would like to remain pivotal in its position as the major producer and the major power broker of the area. This has caused serious problems, which have also caused problems within the larger powers in Europe, in USA, and in Russia. Now, the whole question of oil politics in the Middle East has in fact given rise to a number of terrorist groupings, which started off with an interest of a Western power or Russia to control the oil supplies, and these have burgeoned and developed a life of their own. To start off, we could look at the removal of the Shah of Iran, and the emergence of Khomeini had galvanized Saudi Arabia into a lot of action, in which it had started funding mosques all over the world, especially in Pakistan, Central Asia, and even in India. Now, funding had been given to Pakistan, and the point is that the emergence of Khomeini coincided with the Russians entering into Afghanistan. This made Pakistan a major player and gave rise to the Taliban. Gave rise to the Taliban because there are US oil companies which had wanted to maintain the sanctity of the oil routes, got a group of Pashtuns from Afghanistan, trained them in Pakistan, people who were refugees from the Russian entry into Afghanistan, and created the Taliban. As we know, the Taliban was an artificial creation done with the help of US and Pakistan. Now, this group turned out to be a Frankenstein's monster, took on a life of its own. It was helped and aided by the Al-Qaeda, which had started off in Sudan and again had been supported initially by the US, and had the leaders of the Al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden, had been relocated to Pakistan because they wanted to see that Saudi Arabia was not harmed. Now, this led to the emergence of the Al-Qaeda, which has been the major influence in pan-Islamic movements around the world. What we would see is, as I said, the Taliban becoming a Frankenstein monster, the 9/11/2001 incident happening, there was a clampdown on on Afghanistan and Iraq. Consequently, many groups of Taliban migrated to various areas. Those who were not caught and put into Guantanamo Bay went into various areas, including Iraq, Syria, the Maghreb, and so on. The US, after its initial foray into Afghanistan, also decided to take on Saddam Hussein. This led to the Ba'athist army being abandoned, and with that, a number of underground cells being created by the Al-Qaeda. Many of these underground cells were manned by those who had fled from Afghanistan. One important person was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Now, he started the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, as we can see, morphed into the ISIS. You see, to some extent, the actions of various external agencies, external countries in the Middle East and in Afghanistan has led to dissonance within the local parties, the locals. Like in Afghanistan, there has been a great deal of unhappiness, first about the warlords, then about the Taliban, and then about Pakistan's intervention in the place. Now, also against the US, which has been involving itself into attacks, and there has been a lot of collateral damage. Similarly, in Iraq, there has been a lot of anger against the US. This has led to a large section of the local population being unhappy about US intervention over there and driving people into underground cells. This is the kind of atmosphere, the kind of environment in which organizations like the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, was able to survive. If you talk to Iraqis today, they would tell you that Zarqawi's success was more due to intervention by Western powers than to any specific act of his own. The anger that was there against the involvement of Western powers in Iraq, the disbandment of the Ba'athist army, had created a state of disenchantment with the Western powers, which led to people supporting very extreme steps like extreme leaders like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Now, with this, what we have seen is a situation has been created wherein this has led to a situation where there have been large swaths of people in the Middle East who have been affected by the burgeoning radicalization caused by pan-Islamic groups. Now, how does this radicalization manifest itself? What has been seen is that over the past 20 years, to some extent, radicalization has increased and not decreased. This is because the kind of shibboleths, the kind of propaganda that is being done has had the impact of actually radicalizing people. A Pew survey that had been done 3 years ago showed that in a number of Islamic countries, which include Pakistan, Jordan, Egypt, a large swath of the population agreed that death for apostasy was permissible. They also spoke about the need for removing munafiqs, or those who do not follow their form of Islam, and punishing them for the same. They do talk about polytheists, but would like to remain quiet on this matter. So what we have seen is that a large population, section of the Muslim population are more quietist, insofar as they do not want to question the main tenets of Islam, but believe in them. However, they are unable to come out and openly speak against those aspects of Islam which are contravening democratic norms. When asked, most people in Egypt would say that yes, it would be good if Sharia was the basis of the government. But I mean, the Sharia would come with a number of aspects which would not be in consonance with democratic norms. That is something that they are not willing to discuss as of now. Consequently, now what we have seen is there is a restive population. A restive population which is feeling at odds with the leadership in most countries, because the shibboleths again that have been given by the groundswell of radicals is that these countries are not keeping with Islamic norms. It is in this milieu that something like the Arab Spring occurred, and the Arab Spring was extremely successful, at least in creating public frenzy, if not in actually removing any leaders. It may also be noted that the Arab Spring removed leaders in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Algeria, yes, and also in Libya, which was done through Western intervention, but did not touch the Gulf countries. There is therefore an obvious index, as was shown by the Arab Spring, that there is dissatisfaction with the ruling classes, there is dissatisfaction with the way the governance is being run, and a lot of the propaganda that was there with the Arab Spring was actually very Islamic and very pro-Islamic. When they spoke about democracy, they also spoke about primacy of Islam. When, of course, the Arab Spring turned into what we could only call the winter of discontent a year later, an environment was created again for the support of more radical pan-Islamic groups. It is therefore unsurprising that the major Islamic movements have started now post-Arab Spring. These movements, as did the Al-Qaeda before them, have all, as I said earlier, used the Quran for legitimacy. Now, what are the aspects of Quran that they are using? I'd just like to touch on them. Now, scholars, I would like to say that this is not a critique of Islam by any means. I am just quoting what the radicals are using in their propaganda. The first step that they do is they talk about the Shahada itself, which they say is in a binary form of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, which says that there is no God but Islam and that Muhammad is the last prophet. In this question of there is no God but Allah, there is a question of a we and they concept, a concept that only those followers of Allah are the selected persons. Again, talking about Muhammad being the last prophet, which means that there can be no further change in any aspects of the Sharia, because that is the final word. Now, these have caused, as I said earlier, a number of problems, and the more hardline Salafi groups maintain that any form of interpretation, of the Quran, other than its absolute basic text and the following of its hadiths, is not admissible. Now, this, of course, has led to a situation where any form of innovation, any form of bidah is again not acceptable, though earlier the various schools of jurisprudence used to have interpretations. Here, that is being slowly removed from Islamic propaganda, which is, as far as we are concerned, a dangerous thing, because the more extreme aspects of Islam are being brought about. The other thing that the terrorists claim is the policy of abrogation, wherein a later surah has got greater validity than an earlier surah. Now, according to them, the surahs which came out in Medina have got greater validity than the surahs in Mecca. Now, this is again a problem, ladies and gentlemen, because the Meccan surahs were more benign in nature, and they spoke about education, and that is the time when the Quran spoke about all children of the book being able to live together, and Islam being a religion of peace. Whereas the later surahs, the surahs that have come out in Medina, are more warlike in nature, and has come out with the policies of zakat to anybody who does not accept Islam, and have also spoken about propagating Islam through fire and sword. Therefore, we see that most radical groups use the last verse of Islam, the verse of the sword, as a propaganda material, saying that this was the last verse that Muhammad came out, and therefore Prophet Muhammad brought out, and therefore has greater validity than any other surah. They also use this argument to say that those followers of Islam and those scholars of Islam who claim that Islam is a religion of peace are only cherry picking. They are only talking about some of the surahs which came out in the earlier times when the Prophet was trying to establish himself in Mecca, and not the actual surahs when he went on into Medina. The other aspect that religious groups, the pan-Islamic groups, are taking is the 5 pillars of Islam when they talk about Hajj and Hijrah. Now, they talk about how the Hijrah, which is the movement towards the Caliphate, is an absolute important aspect of Islam which needs to be followed. This, they say, is as important as jihad. Now, consequence of this has been a large movement into those areas of conflict which they say is a conflict that is being done to maintain Islam. So hence we had seen earlier a huge movement of people into Afghanistan, and now we saw a huge movement of people into the Syria and Iraq theatres. Another aspect that the Pan-Islamic groups have used is that of zakat. Ladies and gentlemen, the amount of zakat that is being collected is several times that of the donations given to the UN for humanitarian needs. Now, this begs the question as to why so many Muslims then are living off something like $10. What happens to this money? Where does it go? Now, we find that a lot of the money is going into aspects such as proselytization and also for those conflicts to establish Islam. Now, this, as you can see, is a manner of giving funding to various religious groups and which have very serious consequences. Some of this I could say would be the kind of funding that was given to Zakir Naik for proselytization, the kind of funding that was given by the Saudi Red Cross to Afghanistan at a time when the war was continuing, and when the Afghan war was continuing, and Saudi Red Cross was actually funding various groups. This we could see has been happening with the Islah Party in Yemen, and has been happening with various groups such as the Free Democratic Army of Syria and also the Jabhatul Nusra in Syria. We actually can see movement of money going through zakat in this manner. The other aspect is that of Tokia. Now, earlier it was felt that Tokia, which means that in case you are making a statement which is a lie, but it is permissible under Islam if it is a lie that is being said to propagate the religion and to support your beliefs. Earlier, it was said that Shias who are in a minority in say Saudi Arabia would use this, would hide the fact that they are Shias, tell lies about it in order to survive. But now we see that there are a number of interrogators who say that terrorists, when apprehended, often resort to telling elaborate lies. This we could see in Guantanamo Bay, when a lot of de-radicalization efforts were made, a lot of interrogation was done, and terrorists would come out and say that they do not accept Islam of the more radical variety anymore, but left Guantanamo Bay and immediately joined back into their old organizations, or even set up new organizations. In fact, we can see now that both in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and in Iraq, a number of the leaders have been those who have been released from Guantanamo Bay. This form of Tokia is something that interrogators would need to factor in, and has become extremely difficult to understand what the terrorists are actually saying. These are the aspects that Pan-Islamic groups have been using to legitimize their activity, and also to use Islam for proselytization and for rabble-rousing in a major manner. I would like to just talk about Pan-Islamic movements in the current scenario. The current scenario I would like, for reasons of ease of understanding, to divide it into three segments. One is 9/11/2001 to 2014, 2014 to 2017, 2017 to date. In the pre-9/11 scenario, I have already explained on what happened with the Al-Qaeda, how it was set up, how the Taliban was set up. 9/11 was a black swan. It was a black swan event which was not expected by anybody. I mean, it was expected insofar as we in India had some idea about the fact that the Taliban was planning the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were planning to attack the US, but as is always in these kind of cases, we were unable to give very specific information. Anyway, 9/11 happened, and in Nassim Taleb's terminology, is a classic black swan. Post 9/11, there has been a systemic clampdown on Islamic activities, and there was a period of quietude where there were more underground cells, sleeper cells, than actual activity. But as the drone attacks, as collateral damage went on, as the US Army entered Iraq, as the expansion of US interests in the Middle East burgeoned, we found that that the sleeper cells became more active, which led to the formation of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as I have mentioned before, which was the precursor of the ISIS. Incidentally, Musab al-Zarqawi and al-Baghdadi, the current head of ISIS, both of them were in Afghanistan. They were in a training camp in Herat. They set up the training camp in Herat, and after 9/11 managed to escape through Iran back into Iraq. So this would just show you the continuum of what is happening in these areas. Now, after the death of Zarqawi in 2006, the sleeper cells became actually more active, leading to the emergence of al-Baghdadi, who finally, due to various differences with the Al-Qaeda, decided to set up the ISIS, which is Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, also known as the Daesh. Ideologically speaking, there is very little difference between the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS, except that the ISIS believes in a greater violence against whom they call the munafiqs, whom they call, they say that non-Takfiri forces. They are taking on the Rashiduns, that is because the Shias, because of course they were based in Iraq, where the Shia influence was very heavy, and so one of their main political objectives was to gain dominance in these areas. Now this is this is as far as the 2014 to 2017 events occurred. There we saw that the ISIS had managed to gain prominence. Now, sorry, I need to just wind back a little bit. Again, there has been a lot of local interference other than the pan-Islamic groups, which had given a headwind to the ISIS. This was because, as I explained earlier, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar to some extent were chary about the continuance of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. This is primarily because a huge natural gas find has come just off the port of Tartus in Syria. This would have given, if exploited, would give Syria a huge economic advantage. Gazprom of Russia has already signed up with Syria for exploration of this area. Unsurprisingly, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and to some extent Turkey have tried to use various initiatives to bring down Bashar Assad. While this is not empirically proved, there are witnesses who have said that there has been Saudi, Qatari and Turkish aid to the ISIS, and also a covert US support to the ISIS, which has again not been empirically proved. But the ISIS did have a lot of arms, and they were given support to move initially. After they found that the ISIS was becoming another Frankenstein monster, the Al-Qaeda in that area, which has been typified by the Jabhat al-Nusra, has reportedly been supported by these countries in order to act as a counter to ISIS on one hand, and to bring down and minimize Bashar Assad's efforts on the other. Now, 2014 to 2017 witnessed the worst form of violence in the world after the Second World War. There has been more brutal killings, more savagery than was even conceivable in a 21st century milieu. All countries have been supposedly waging war against the ISIS. After Russia also got into the act, as did Iran, to some extent the ISIS power has been curtailed. Initially, it may be recalled that ISIS said that they were breaking down the barriers, the border between Iraq and Syria, the Sykes-Picot line, and that they would take over both areas. What does this mean for us in India? While our security forces can pat themselves on the back, and very justifiably so, saying that with a huge Muslim population, the number of Muslims who have involved themselves into these pan-Islamic groups are very few. That is right. But to all these people, I would only say one thing. Please remember that in the larger scenario, only 0.02% of the Muslims have actually been involved in terrorism, and you please see the kind of havoc that has been created in the world. Therefore, to just talk about small percentages is perhaps not completely giving full weightage to the situation. What we have seen is that Pakistan, which has been traditionally using Islam as a foreign policy initiative and terrorism as a foreign policy initiative, has been able to some extent utilize divisions within Indian Muslims. I would just bring up the case of Bhatkal, a state in Karnataka, state in Mangalore, Karnataka. It's a small district, a small town in Mangalore, where there is a considerable amount of affluence. Both the Bhatkal brothers and the Armar brothers, the Bhatkal brothers who are with the Al-Qaeda and the Armar brothers who are with the ISIS, are from Bhatkal. And we see that there has been a similar kind of a movement with Kerala over there. Now, this again is because the Pan-Islamic movement in the south has been very different from what it is in the north. We need to remember that the first mosque in India was actually set up not in Uttar Pradesh but in Kerala. And radicalization in Kerala has been of a more philosophical nature rather than a violent nature, where people have, through trade, accepted Islam and have got themselves converted. The movement of these people into the Gulf has been very much more than others, and they have been accepted by the Gulf countries as very good workers, and these are the people who have been radicalized, as can be seen in the last arrest made by NIA just about a week ago of 5 people from Kerala and Karnataka who were in Qatar, had got radicalized and were planning to join the ISIS. Comes now to Kashmir. Now, Pakistan has been using Islam regularly, we all know that. Now, there is some evidence of ISIS coming into Kashmir. We don't know if it is ISIS or just ISI using another form. But whatever it is, what we see is that today in the youth bulge in Kashmir, there is greater radicalization than there has ever been before. And this is the point I was making also about the Middle East. When a public is exposed to huge amounts of propaganda and shibboleths, the chances of their getting collaterally radicalized is very high. I therefore would say that when Riaz Naiku comes out with his propaganda YouTube messages, which have got a number of, it is conveyed a number of times, retweeted a number of times. These are matters which we have to take extremely seriously. I'd just like to say that I'd like to draw your attention to the Chechen problem in Russia, which started off with the Republic of Ichkeria, where the Chechen people were saying that they want equal rights for the Chechen people, much like the separatists claim in Kashmir. That soon became the Emirate of Kavkaz, and the tenor of the Chechen movement has changed a great deal. today, this is what is happening in Kashmir. The tenor of the movement is not so much separatism alone, but there is a question of harking back to Islam. Now, this is a very dangerous matter, and this is a matter which can burn Pakistan as much as it burns the local Kashmiris, and we need to really note about what is happening there. Pakistan being the country which has given safe havens to the Taliban. Now, when we talk about the Taliban, there is the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, the Punjabi Taliban based in Muridke who are Kashmir focused, the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. So when people talk about negotiating with the Taliban, one wonders which group of Taliban they are actually talking to. The group of Taliban that are being involved in any kind of negotiations, which incidentally have broken off now, are only those Taliban which are affiliated to some extent with the ISI and the Pakistani government. What is happening now is that it is a past is prologue kind of situation in Afghanistan, where the Taliban has taken over about 50% of the country. The national unity government, which is attempting to keep up a more moderate form of Islam and a more moderate government, is finding it difficult to survive. The US and Russia are talking to the Taliban because that is the proximate reality of Afghanistan now. And we can see, given these developments, that our borders are going to be in for a long period of instability, not through any other means, but through Islamic ripples of Islamic movements along the borders. I would also tell you, ladies and gentlemen, due to lack of time, whatever I need to say on the terrorist financing part, I will give it to you in terms of written notes and material. And in the meanwhile, I would just say the Pan-Islamic movement is a problem for us in India. We cannot close our eyes to that. Yes, it is true that we have not been as affected as other countries, but we need to be eternally vigilant to see that nothing burgeons further than what is happening now, and that we maintain our links with the Muslim community, with the communities outside and the diaspora, to see to it that we can curtail any kind of fledgling movement that starts up in our country.